Hi everyone and welcome back to Chess for Charity. In this video, I'm going to show you the most amazing retrograde puzzle ever. The puzzle here is to figure out what is on h4. It's a chess mystery here. We're not told the color, we're not told whether it's a piece or a pawn, we're not told anything about what is on h4. All we're told is that something is on h4. So your job is to figure out with the information that's on this board. There's all this information hidden here. You have to uncover this information and figure it out. So if you want to be a chess detective here, stick around and we'll figure it out. Before I start showing the solution, let me just quickly encourage you to subscribe if you have not yet already. Half of the income that I earn in this channel goes directly to charity. So subscribing, liking, all of that stuff helps me out so much. Okay, let's get started here. So the goal is to figure out what's on h4, but we probably should start with just looking at the king in check, kind of some of the pawn structure, some of the stuff that hides these clues. So the first thing we should look at is this check. Okay, this rook on d7 is checking the king on b7. And we have to ask ourselves, how did this rook create this check? Well, it can't have moved there, right? It couldn't have moved to d7 because if, for example, it was on c7, it wouldn't have been legal to move it to d7 because it would have already been in check, right? This is not a legal move because I'm already checking the king. And the same idea goes with d6, e7, and d8. I couldn't have moved my rook from any of those squares to d7. Why? Because those squares are occupied. Okay, now what is that telling me? That's telling me that d7 was not the point where everything happened. Instead, there was something here that created a discovered check on the king. Right, that's retrograde 101 right there. Okay, so what am I saying? Well, since there's a rook here, the rook couldn't have moved from c7 to d8. That's not possible. Instead, it must have been a pawn. And a pawn captured something. We don't know what. I'll just put a pawn for just a moment. We don't know what. This captured something and promoted to a rook. Okay. Our question then is, what did white's pawn capture? Well, like I said, it can't be a pawn because that's only on the 8th rank, right? Pawns are going this way. Could it be a bishop? Well, no. Why is that? Well, if it were a bishop, this f8 square, where the bishop is home square, would not be able to escape and make its way to d8. So how would this bishop get here? It's impossible. The pawn structure does not allow a bishop on f8 to run around and get there. So it can't be a bishop. I should probably talk about the major pieces as well. Could it be a queen? It might look like, sure, why not? I can take that with check. But the answer is no. And it's for a very similar reason as the rook before. How would this queen have gotten to d8? It must have moved from one of these squares. But if it made that move, the king would already be in check. That doesn't make sense, right? It can't be here because that would already be check on the original square it was originally on. So it can't be a queen. Same idea with the rook. It can't be a rook for the same reasons it can't be a queen because arriving on that square would have already generated a check, right? Hopefully that point makes some sense. So it can't be a queen, a rook, or a bishop, or a pawn for that matter. Therefore, it must be a knight. And here we have to notice something pretty interesting. There are 3 knights on the board. What does that tell me about the nature of this whole puzzle? Well, it means, and my first thing to remember, is that the only way this happened, sorry, I already showed the rook, the only way this happened is if black underpromoted. Black must have underpromoted because we have 3 knights on the board. And you start chess with 2 knights. Okay, so that helps. Now, let me ask about h4. Let's talk about what could have been on h4. Could it be a pawn on h4? Well, no. And why not? So I'm leaving the board like this just for a second to show how many pawns are on the board. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But there are 3 knights. This is impossible. We need one of these pawns to promote to a knight. In particular, We need this h pawn to promote to a knight. Therefore, the pawn that I'm showing right here in h4 cannot be the missing piece. So let's throw that out. What about the bishop? Can we have a bishop on h4? A black bishop? Well, no, because for the same reason I just showed, it would have to escape this pawn chain. It's locked in behind this little pawn blockade here, behind this pawn chain. So the answer is no, it cannot be a black bishop. How about another knight? Could it be a knight? No. Why not? As I just showed, there are only 7 pawns on board here. And we know this h-pawn is this knight. So there's nothing that we could promote to get to this knight on h4. Therefore, it's not a knight. What about a rook or a queen? Well, it follows the same logic as before, which is that it couldn't have arrived on this square. That would be check. And all this whole sequence of giving check like this, like this, promote to a rook, this would not be legal because your king would be in check the whole time, right? So it can't be a rook and it can't be a queen for the same reason. Well, if it can't be any black piece, we can deduce just from that, my third point, the piece on h4 must be white. So cool. Okay, so let's start from there and let's see if we can figure out what white piece is it. Already, it's pretty amazing to see what we can do here. Okay, so let's talk about what is possible to be here. So we have these pawns. How many pawns are there? There are 7 pawns. And we know that this pawn that was on c7 just promoted to a rook, right? I just showed that. I'll leave this position like this, just if it helps you visualize. So there are 8 pawns on the board right now, which means this h4 missing piece, white missing piece, cannot be a pawn. Great. So we're left with a few options. We're left with a knight, we're left with a bishop, we're left with a rook, and we're left with a queen. Okay, let's now start talking about what black captured to get into this pawn position. Let's revisit the pawn structure a little bit. So we know, like I said, that this pawn on h7 was the thing that promoted and became this rook. How do we know that? Well, the a pawns must have happened by the b7 pawn going to a6, the f7 pawn capturing, and capturing to make c4, and this h7 pawn promoting to become a knight. Great. So we know that the missing pawn came from h7. Awesome. Let's make a note of that. We know that the pawn came from h7. So we have to ask ourselves, where did this pawn promote? Right? This pawn started here, and it had to promote somewhere. Did it promote, like, did it go this way? Oops, like this. Maybe I'll do like this. Did it go straight down and maybe like this? Or maybe some other way, like making little shapes? How do we know? How do we figure this out? Or some other way. Maybe it went this way and then back. How do we know? It's beautiful. How do we know these things? This information is actually on the board. Okay, so let's talk about what's missing from White's area, from White's camp here. So how many pieces on the board are White's? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Don't forget this h4 piece we determined is white. So I'm going to mark this as 11, which means there are 5 missing pieces from White's camp. Okay, now how does that help us? Well, we already determined that this pawn captured once, and this pawn captured 1, 2, 3 times. Okay, so I just said there were 11 pieces, and that means we're missing 5 of them, and there are 4 captures, which means I only have 1 more capture left. Right? Does that math work out? Make sure it makes sense. 4 captures and 11 pieces are on board. That gives me 15 possible things. I need 1 more because you start a game with 16 pieces, which means this h-pawn captured exactly once. That's the key point to remember. Right? Hopefully you're still with me. This is a lot of fun. So like I said, 11 pieces on board, counting the missing one. We know now that the h7 pawn made exactly one capture. That means it must have captured on the G file, either here or somewhere else. Maybe any of these other squares. Now the question is, which path did it take? Did it go straight down the H file and then capture on G2? Or did it go this way and go right through? And you might say to me, what do you mean? How would it go through this G pawn? Let me explain what I mean. So there are two possibilities here. And this is kind of the crux of the puzzle. So if you're still with me, really make sure this is the piece that you're understanding. This pawn configuration, this could have occurred by the pawn starting on G2 and moving up one. No kidding, right? Or it could have occurred, let's go back to the beginning like this. It could have occurred by this F pawn capturing something, and then this G pawn being the one that ends up on C7. And that would eventually end up here. How do we know which one happened? So one of the two things happened. One would be the F pawn promoted and the G pawn moved. And the other would be the G pawn promoted and the F pawn captured. How do we determine these things? This is the key. Well, we have to evaluate what is missing from black's camp. Okay, so what can we figure out? We can figure out that one of these two things under promoted to the rook, right? If the pawn on G3 came from F2, like this, that would tell us that the G pawn under promoted to the rook. So like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then promote, 5. 5 captures, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, and then once it's on C7, 5. Okay, is that fine? Is that legal? Well, that's the question. Let's think about it. How many pieces is black missing? Well, they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So they're missing 5 pieces. And right now I need 5 captures. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That seems perfect, right? This is the very delicate part of the proof. The answer is no. Why? Because the F8 bishop could not have been captured by a pawn. It had to not leave this pawn blockade, remember? So that means that it's impossible from the G pawn to get all the way to C7. This configuration, having this capture and then this capture, like that, that's impossible. Because, especially this too, not enough captures, it doesn't really work out because you need to capture this bishop. This bishop is not being captured by a pawn. Therefore, what does that mean? That means it was the F pawn the whole time that ended up going 1, 2, 3, 4, right? That's it. Great. So what does that tell me? Let me go to my next piece here. As I already mentioned, the pawn captured on G2 and promoted on G1. I'm going to get there. So because we know this was the configuration, that means the H pawn ran down the board and captured something on G2, and therefore they promoted on G1, right? That's the key point to get from that. Now, why is that important? What's the point of that? Well, here is just an amazing part of this whole proof, and hopefully you're still hanging with me because it's an incredible puzzle, and it's just genius, this whole composition. We have to ask ourselves, how did black, we'll put the pawn there, go all the way down and capture on this square? Why is that important? Well, let's mark out the squares where things were captured. Okay, G2, we'll put it in orange. G2 or yellow. A6, we know that captures happened on this square, this one, and this one. Do you notice a pattern between all these squares? Anything important there? They're all light squares. Every single square on the board that has happened to capture is a white square. The B7 pawn captured on A6, a light square. The F7 pawn captured on E6, D5, C4. And we just determined that this H pawn captured on G2. Why is that important? Well, it's important because we know how many pieces are missing again? There are 5 pieces that are missing. Well, how does this make sense? Because we have 5 light squares, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, here's the key, and this is perhaps the biggest key of the whole thing. We know that there are 5 captures on light squares, which means you have to imagine what they captured. Because remember, we already counted this square. This thing is not counted into the missing pieces. So because H4 is not counted in the missing pieces, and there are 5 missing pieces, and they were all captured on light squares, what does that mean? If you didn't get it from just that sentence, it means that this must be a bishop, because this is a dark squared bishop, and this could not have been captured like all these other ones on light squares. That's it. That's the answer. It must be a bishop. Let me go to the next one. So that's it. Both bishops could not have been captured on light squares because we know that's not how chess works. Instead, these 5 pieces must be something else, which means that the missing piece is a bishop on H4. Super amazing retrograde puzzle. Hopefully you're able to follow that. Hopefully my notes helped. If you did follow it and this did help, let me know, please. I like these puzzles. They're a little hard to explain. I hope that I did it justice. Amazing puzzle by Raymond Smullyan, I think is how you say his name. Wonderful composer. Perhaps my favorite puzzles of all time. It is crazy that you can deduce all that information from just the board. But that is it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please like, please subscribe. All that stuff helps me out tremendously. But yeah, that's it for now. And thank you so much. Bye.